Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a cold near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
If you followed my work for some time, you will know my fondness for military history and military and defense issues. Fondness, not quite nerdy, so I won't say that I am somebody who's doing primary research, but I'm reading up a lot. Now, given that today being 16th of December, which is the anniversary of the completion or the victory in the 1971 war, the Bangladesh war, was a good occasion to talk about one aspect of that war or that history. However, we've talked about this many times in the past. I will share a couple of links with you with the description of when we've talked about some aspects of that war, as we have done with 1965, with 1962, with China, Kargil, etc., etc., etc. This particular episode has actually been triggered by three things. The first spark came from somebody I met coincidentally, or I was privileged to meet coincidentally. This was at a sizable event at Balaji University in Pune, also in partnership with Corporate Citizen magazine run by my former colleague from Indian Express, Vinita Deshmukh. I was delivering a keynote there. At that event, they were also honoring some of the heroes of the 1971 war who live in Pune. Now, one of those veterans of the 1971 war being honored at that event turned out to be Group Captain Hemant Sharad Kumar Sardesai. Now, Group Captain Hemant Sharad Kumar Sardesai, Veer Chakra body. Important thing is, what did he win his Veer Chakra for? He got that Veer Chakra as a flight lieutenant for being part of a 6 MiG formation that carried out a daytime rocket attack followed by 2 hunters finding their front cannon on the governor's house in Dacca. That is 14th of December 1971. That is when a kind of cabinet meeting was taking place to decide on a future course of action. And the fact that the meeting was taking place, that leaked to Indian intelligence because they were able to intercept a cable that was sent out from Dhaka to West Pakistan to the headquarters. So they knew this important meeting was taking place, and it might make a big impact if an air raid was taking out, because that will break the leader's morale. Because it was in the interest of India that Pakistanis should agree to surrender instead of risking urban warfare in a heavily defended city like Dhaka, which had 4-layer defense set up by Lieutenant General A.K. Niazi. And those can be, besides the fact that those can cost a lot of lives, they can also cost civilian lives, but that would have also delayed the end of the war, because the USS Enterprise, US 7th Fleet Task Force was getting closer. They were there menacingly as a kind of coercive diplomacy. The Chinese were getting impatient. India had a narrow window of action of just about 2 weeks, which was ending now. So, important thing was to bring this war to an end. And this MiG strike struck that decisive blow, because as the strike was taking place, the so-called cabinet was meeting, the ministers were meeting in Dhaka, and before that meeting was over, they sent out word that they had no intention to fight and they will agree on surrender. And so that was the first spark, meeting Group Captain Sardesai, wonderful man. The second spark was something that happened this morning. This morning, Air Marshal Diptendu Chaudhary, who retired as Commandant of the National Defence College, again a serious thinking air warrior, he sent me a message this morning that, look, there's a lot of talk about 1971, but is the IAF given adequate credit for what it did in 1971, or has enough been said about the IAF, particularly in the western sector? Because in the eastern sector, as I told you, IAF's record has been talked about quite a bit. In fact, there's been a landmark book about that written by PVS Jagan Mohan and Sameer Chopra called Eagles Over Bangladesh. In fact, in January of 2014, I had done a full national interest on this book when it had come out, and I had then expressed the hope that they will do a similar one on the Western sector as well, on the Indian Air Force's role in the Western sector as well, because that was much more contested, because the Pakistan Air Force was basically in the Western sector. In the Eastern sector, they had just left one squadron of sabers there, which Indian Air Force was able to deal with very quickly. So in the Western sector, by day 3 of the war, India had total air superiority, because all they had against them was one squadron, 16 sabers, and the Indian forces lined up there were about 161 aircraft. So it was 10:1. You might say 10:1 is too much, but the idea was that this was to give support to the army units also and to navy units operating there, so they could move as fast as possible, because everybody knew that you could not have carried on that war forever, because there was so much international pressure. And at the same time, the Soviets also had their limitations on how long they'll be able to hold off the US, China most importantly, which was making hostile noises, and the UN Security Council. That's why such a large contingent of the Air Force was deployed in the eastern sector, despite Pakistan's much smaller challenge. But what it meant was that on the eastern sector, IAF did not quite have the kind of superiority it could have had if the distribution of forces were a bit more equitable. That's why the operations on the western sector acquire even more importance. Now, previous Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra never wrote that western sector book. However, Air Marshal Dipendra Chaudhary sent to me a paper that he wrote for IDSA, that is the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, and that paper was published in the MPIDSA Journal of Defense. So that was the second spark. What was the third spark? When Air Marshal Dipendra Chaudhary got me interested, and this was coming on top of that fortuitous meeting, I won't say encounter, with Group Captain Sardesai in Pune, I started Googling a little bit, because I remembered that Admiral Arun Prakash, former Chief of Naval Staff, also wrote something for the print about this, about the recording of the history of the air war in the western sector in particular by a Pakistani. And that Pakistani Air Force veteran is Air Commodore Kaiser Tufail. Kaiser Tufail wrote a book from which Admiral Arun Prakash drew a couple of references in an article he wrote. And the article he wrote for the print was very mature and very fair, like most of the stuff he would write and say. He's most unlike your prime time generals and admirals and air marshals who can destroy the enemy in about 3 sound bites every evening. Admiral Arun Prakash is not one of those. Important thing is, he's also somebody who's seen real combat. In 1971 war, he was on secondment to an Indian Air Force squadron, 20th Squadron, and carried out bombing and strafing missions over very highly defended, very well defended Pakistani air base. In fact, the raids he carried out also include the storied one at Chaklala Air Base. Among the targets destroyed was a small transport aircraft allocated for use by American fighter pilot Chuck Yeager, the man who first broke the sound barrier, and at that time was working as an advisor to Pakistan Air Force as part of the American military assistance program. And check out his autobiography. He does a lot of tall talk. And in his autobiography, and he said that during the 1971 war, particularly because he thought he was training the Pakistan Air Force, they, quote unquote, achieved a 3:1 kill ratio against Indian Air Force, destroying 102 Indian aircraft as compared to 34 of their own. So that's exactly 3 times. He calculated it right. So what did Arun Prakash say? In that article, he said that, look, we Indians don't read military history. And that's the reason someone like Chuck Yeager can get away with this kind of nonsense, because the expression he used in his autobiography was that in the air, the Pakistanis, and I quote from the autobiography, whipped the Indians' asses, achieving a kill rate of 3:1. That's from the autobiography, and that is what Admiral Arun Prakash quoted. And he said, why does it happen? He said, this happens because we pay no attention to history. So I will quote the exact line from him. And he wrote, we Indians have always disregarded the advice from Herodotus to George Santayana. And what is the consequence? And I quote, Indians have consistently ignored the importance of reading, writing, and learning from history. The reason he wrote that article was that around that time, Kaiser Tufail's book had also come out. Kaiser Tufail gave history. Kaiser Tufail, in two of his postings, had been in charge of Pakistan Air Force's historical data. So he had some facts with him. So his book came out at that time, and the book has a very interesting name, Whereby Lies a Story. That book is called In the Ring and on Its Feet. Now, what does it mean? It's like a boxer, right? A boxer goes down, is knocked over, but is still in the ring and is still on its feet, so can fight. It's only when the boxer is out for a count and cannot get up with the count that the boxer is knocked out. So this was a boxing metaphor. Important thing is, where did that metaphor come from? And that is what Arun Prakash caught on to. That metaphor came from the history of 1971 war, written by Indian scholar S.N. Prasad and some colleagues, still available to researchers for reading. But it was never given the status of the official history of the 1971 war. And that is the problem that Arun Prakash spoke about. That our bureaucrats, he said, are obdurate. And he said we have an obdurate bureaucracy which uses an omerta over official records. And that's why nothing really comes out. But this book by S.N. Prasad is there. There in the book, he says, he gives a compliment to the PAF because after all, wars are not like commando comics, and wars are also not like what you see on your warrior channels at prime time. Unfortunately, wars are very painful. There is always the other side fighting, and there is cost on both sides. And your adversaries are not like the comedians that you see on Sunny Deol movies. Remember border? Pakistanis can fight their battles. They are a pretty good Army, Navy, Air Force, and Indian Army, Navy, Air Force will acknowledge that. There is a healthy respect between adversaries. So, S.N. Prasad, writing this history of 1971 war, he comments the PAF. Maybe there's a little bit of left-handedness to it in how he elaborates it, but he comments the Pakistan Air Force for taking on an adversary twice as big, that is Indian Air Force. And then he goes on to say, by its refusal to close in with its stronger enemy, it at least remained on its feet and in the ring when the bell sounded. So what he means is that Pakistan Air Force deliberately or tactically chose not to get baited into too much combat with Indian Air Force, which was much superior, and maybe conserved its strength for a later stage in the war. So even the Indian, you may not call it official history, but this is a very healthy and robustly written history that also acknowledges it. And that is the line about Pakistan Air Force on its feet and in the ring that Air Commodore Kaiser Tufail picked up for his book. Now, of course, he made his own claims. Indian official history says that Pakistan lost 57 aircraft. Indian official history acknowledges India's loss of about 56 aircraft, but Indian official history gives details of 46 Pakistani aircraft lost with tail numbers, etc. Kaiser Tufail claims only 27 were lost, but those are arguments that go on. So when Arun Prakash wrote this article, picking up some lines from Kaiser Tufail wrote to us asking if he could write a rejoinder. We checked with Admiral Arun Prakash. He said, perfectly fine. It's a good thing. We must debate across the border. And then Kaiser Tufail wrote a rejoinder. You will see both on your screens as I talk. You will also get the links with the description of this video. So this was the third thing which became a trigger. It was this triple spark that then got me reading Air Marshal Diptendu Chaudhary's paper. And here is the paper. I will share a link with you. You can read the whole thing. The paper also has a very good bibliography. So I would comment to you strongly, particularly the UPSC types. Please look at that bibliography. I will also list some of the books for you, some of the important books for you. This paper is titled Eagle Unleashed, IAF Strategy on Operations. And this does talk briefly about the eastern sector, but this is much more about the western sector. He tells us what was the larger Indian objective. Time was at a premium, so there was limited time in which India had to achieve its objectives. So number one, to assist the Mukti Bahini in liberating a large enough part of East Pakistan so the refugees could be sent away. Second, prevent Pakistan from capturing any Indian territory of consequence in Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Rajasthan or Gujarat. this was to be achieved by offensive defense and not merely by passive line holding. And third, to defend the integrity of India in case of a Chinese attack in the north. Now, I've not really got a conclusive answer from anybody yet, but sometimes I wonder if this is how, this is why that code name was chosen for the 1971 war, the Indian planning for 1971 war, Cactus Lily. So be prickly and tough in one area and to be more sorted and not gentle, but more calm and defensive in the other. So attacking in the east, defending in the western sector. And then he says, based on this, how did the IAF determine its own air strategy? So there were 5 elements. Number 1, defense of the home bases, because he said IAF remembered the experience of 1965 war when it lost a lot of aircraft on the ground. So defense of home bases was very important. Second, assist in the army in the field, and to do so, gain and maintain, and this is an interesting expression, FAS or favorable air situation. That's different from air superiority when your adversary is not present at all in the air. That's what India achieved in the eastern sector. He says, given the balance of power in the western sector, to achieve total air superiority wasn't possible. So in all tactical battle areas in particular or important zones, it was necessary and it was realistic to establish favorable air situation, and that was part of the IAF strategy. Third, conduct counter-air operations, that is CAO, to reduce the effectiveness of Pakistan Air Force by destroying its aircraft and bases. Fourth, provide air transport support to own surface forces, particularly the army. And fifth, provide maritime support to the Indian Navy. He also makes a good reading of the Pakistani strategy in that war. He said Pakistani strategy to defend East Pakistan, because they knew that's what India wanted to liberate. Their strategy was based on the belief that defense of East Pakistan lay in West Pakistan. What that meant was that it's not going to be possible to fight in East Pakistan very effectively except delaying India. But if we can carry out offensive operations in the western sector and take enough territory from India or force India to shift its forces from east to the west, our purpose will be achieved, because one, we'll have territory to trade later, particularly if we capture territory in Jammu and Kashmir. Second, by delaying this, we'll be able to get international intervention and thereby stop India short of achieving its objectives in the eastern sector. So once again, the principle the Pakistanis followed was that defense of East Pakistan lay in West Pakistan. It was assessing all this that Air Marshal Chaudhary says that CONOPS or concept of operations was drawn by the IAF, and there a lot of detail is available in the fine memo written by then Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal. Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal was the Vice Chief during the 1965 war, and he had seen that very closely, and he had also made a very close, realistic and honest study of some adverse outcomes in the 1965 war, and he had tried to plug all those gaps before 1971, and that's why the outcome was different. Operations in the East we know a lot more about. In fact, if I find it tomorrow, I will do a video version of what I had written based on that book on the 1971 air war in the eastern sector, Eagles over Bangladesh. However, the western sector was much more contested. In the west, Air Marshal Chaudhary says Indian Air Force IAF had 24 fighter or fighter bomber squadrons and 4 bomber squadrons. Those would be Canberras. These included 2 squadrons of legacy Mysteers as well as Vampires, totaling 419 aircraft, while PAF had 13 fighter bomber squadrons totaling 288 aircraft. These figures are established on both sides in the Pakistani accounts as well. This translated into a force ratio of 1.45:1, 1.45 to India, which is just about 1.5 times more than Pakistan Air Force in the beginning of the war on 3rd December. This, he said, increased to 1.6 in India's favor, 1.6:1 after 8th and 9th December, when 1 squadron each of Hunters and MiG-21s was redeployed to the west, because by this time the war in the east was coming to an end. There was total air superiority. Pakistani Air Force had ceased to exist there. So these 2 squadrons, 1 each of one each of MiG-21 and Hunter was shifted to the western sector. However, including the F-86 Sabres, F-104 fighters and MiG-19 aircraft from Jordan, Iran, China and Saudi Arabia, this was a different world where Jordan, Iran, Saudi Arabia were even willing to transfer their own aircraft immediately to Pakistan, and China, of course, transferred some. These supplemented the PF inventory by 2 additional squadrons worth of fighters, and that again reduced the IAF's ratio to 1.45:1. So it's not as if PAF was fighting a force 3 times its size. Now, Air Marshal Chaudhary actually has very precise figures in his paper. He says in the western sector, IAF carried out 4,509 combat sorties. There were many other sorties, transport, helicopters, casualty evacuation, etc. But for combat, Indian Air Force carried out 4,509 sorties. Of this, 41.3% were air defense or to establish favorable air situation. I didn't say air superiority, favorable air situation, which means if there's a battle going on in some area, you have sufficient presence in that area in the air that would deter your adversary from coming in there. That's what becomes a favorable air situation. So 41.3% of these 4,509 sorties were for air defense. 8.9% counter air operations, that is attacking your adversaries' air bases, etc. That's a very expensive operation. 0.8% for strategic strikes. That's on oil refineries, that's on a gas plant. All of this happened in the 71 war. That's on railway stations or logistical hubs. All of that happened in the 71 war. In fact, the first successful strike on the oil tanks in Karachi on 4th of December was carried out by the Indian Air Force. And for a long time, it seemed like Indian Navy was getting credit for it, because around the same time, just a little bit later, Indian Navy also carried out its brilliant missile attacks using its missile boats on the same oil tanker farm. But the first fires were lit by the IAF. These were hunters that took off from Jamnagar. They were part of an operational training unit. The squadron commander, Marshal Chaudhary writes, drew up his own plans. He was permitted, and they carried out these raids. And they didn't get the time to write the history of this raid, even in their own squadron records, because immediately on their return, they were asked to move to Jamnagar. And we remember what was happening from Jamnagar Air Base. It's from the Jamnagar Air Base that the Indian Air Force was fighting the big Pakistani planned thrust at Longewala, which actually had aimed to capture Jaisalmer Air Base. 0.8% of strategic strikes out of 4,509 is not a small number. It's about 40 of them, and 3.1% for reconnaissance. If you want the numbers for the war overall, that is western as well as eastern sectors, IAF in 1971 carried out 11,549 sorties, of which 6,604 were combat sorties. Now, there are always claims and counterclaims over the losses. Indian official records say that Pakistan lost 60 aircraft, India lost 56. So India has actually been quite realistic counting its own losses. Even on the Pakistani side, even Kaiser Tufail does not say India lost 102 or 105, but like Chuck Yeager says. He also claims India lost 60 aircraft. India itself acknowledges the loss of 56 aircraft. However, A. Marshal Chaudhary points out that of the 50 fighter losses by Indian Air Force, 20 are attributable to close air operations, when the aircraft go low to support your armies or to control that area to deter the adversary's air force from coming in, because that's when you get exposed to anti-aircraft and small arms fire. None of these 20 losses was to any air combat. The important thing in war is that it's not about just the numbers. Uska 20 mara, uska 50 mara, uska 100 mara, mera 5 mara, uska 200 mara, not like that. A war is not a game of sport where whoever has greater numbers, whoever scores more wins. It depends on what your objectives are and to what extent you've been able to achieve these objectives. Accordingly, in the western sector, the view of the IAF, which Air Marshal Dipyendu Chaudhary also expresses or explains in this paper, is that our job was to make sure the Pakistanis don't get any breakthrough anywhere, and the army is fully supported in ensuring that. So the areas where vulnerabilities developed, Hussainiwala, where a battalion of Punjab regiment was cut off and encircled by the Pakistanis, Indian Air Force carried out 24 sorties at some cost to itself because those were low-level sorties. They were exposed to ground fire and lost a couple of aircraft. But those sorties were carried out to extricate this battalion. Fazilka, Suleiman Ke Hai, those are areas where it looked like Pakistanis were on the verge of achieving some sort of a breakthrough because they were quite desperate. They were flinging in a lot of forces. Also, they were waiting. They had kept a large reserve in Bahawalpur to carry out a big thrust through the desert if the war went on. So Indian Air Force also had to carry out a lot of preemptive action, particularly using bombers at night and also AN-12 transport aircraft loaded with bombs to attack those areas to prevent Pakistani troop and armor concentrations. The net effect of all of this is that Pakistan was dissuaded, discouraged, essentially deterred from trying out something truly adventurous in the Western sector, and that bought India enough time to close the issue in this Eastern sector. And that gave India enough time to close the issue in the Eastern sector. Now, before I let you go, I will tell you two things. One, I told you that I'll give you a list of readings. So first of all, of course, PVS Jagan Mohan and Sameer Chopra, Eagles over Bangladesh. Then S.N. Prasad and others, Mystery of the 1971 India-Pakistan War. Then Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, My Years with the IAF. Then Air Marshal A.K. Tiwari, IAF in War. Then former Army Chief and Kashmir Governor, General K.V. Krishna Rao, Prepare or Perish. Fazal Mukim Khan, very important book, you will find it on internet. Fazal Mukim Khan, Pakistan's Crisis in Leadership. Then a paper by Pushpinder Singh, India's best-known air war historian. Pushpinder Singh, Ravi Rikhe and Peter Steinman. The book is Fizaiya, Psyche of the Pakistan Air Force, Psyche of the PAF. Then A.K. Niazi, the Pakistani general who surrendered. A.K. Niazi, Betrayal of East Pakistan. Major General D.K. Palit, The Lightning Campaign. And then, of course, In the Ring and On Its Feet by Kaiser Tufail. And Death Wasn't Painful by D.S. Jaffer. D.S. Jaffer, by the way, was a Sukhoi pilot, a Sukhoi squadron commander. He was staff officer to the Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, when war was about to begin. So he went to him and said, look, war's about to begin. I can't be doing a staff job. I'm going back to my squadron. His squadron was among those who carried out these really risky, low-level ground operations in support of the Indian Army, particularly beleaguered units. And he was among those shot down, was taken prisoner of war, was injured. It was under his watch that IAF prisoners of war carried out a very audacious escape attempt. 3 pilots escaped only to be caught on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. And since I'm a storyteller, let me tell you a story about D.S. Jaffa. In 1985 or thereabouts, when nobody quite knew that there was a Babri Masjid, Ram Janmabhoomi kind of problem, it was very dormant. I happened to go to Faizabad, Ayodhya, in the course of usual political travels in Uttar Pradesh, and somebody advised me to go and meet a veteran Air Force officer who was running a gas agency, an LPG agency. So I went to that gas agency and met the Air Force officer. That was none else than Group Captain D.S. Jaffa. So I heard the story of what had happened to his Sukhoi and to his prisoner of war camp in Pakistan in 1971. But more than that, he said, you have no idea, India's biggest political story is now shaping up in Faizabad, Ayodhya. And I said, what is that? And he said, there is this old mosque and there are claims something had happened in 1948. All of that story, and the idols came in, all of that story, nobody in Indian media was particularly familiar with at that point. And then we know what happened. By 1989, Mr. Advani had started his Rath Yatra, and the rest of the history we know quite well. So D.S. Jaffa had the knack of getting into places where the action was. In fact, I have done a 2-part walk the talk with 2 of them. The third one, by that time, unfortunately, it passed away. I will share those links also with you. And we had recorded this in the Air Force Museum in Delhi.